All right, guys. So I got to walk you through this Supreme Court decision. This is actually a gigantic deal. So there was a big disagreement and case over the U.S. government versus the Texas state government. They were having a border dispute. So the other day on the show, we actually talked about this, how there were two children and a woman that ended up dying because they drowned in the river, and U.S. Border Patrol agents, so the federal agents, were trying to get through to help them, but Texas State National Guard blocked them and said, you can't do that. Now, that up front, right off the bat, is a problem here, right? Because why would the federal agents defer to the Texas State National Guard? The chain of command actually goes the other way. The state agents have to defer to the federal agents, but that's not what happened. And so as a result, those people died. There's been other examples of other people dying, crossing into the U.S. because Texas is taking a very draconian approach, almost a militaristic approach to anybody coming into the country. So the Supreme Court heard a case about the razor wire that's being used at the southern border. This is razor wire that was put up by the state of Texas. And the federal government said, look, we're in charge of the border. This is the federal border. This is the country's border, the nation's border. Texas can't have their own separate border policy from Arizona, who has a separate one from California. This is all the border that we are in control of as, the federal government, the national level government. And this went all the way to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court allowed Border Patrol agents to remove razor wire Texas installed at the Mexico border. Let me read through some of this for you. A closely divided Supreme Court, by the way, that is really important. We're going to come back to that in a minute. Closely divided Supreme Court on Monday allowed Border Patrol agents to cut through or move razor wire Texas installed on the U.S.-Mexico border as part of the state's effort to prevent illegal border crossings. Again, just to point out real quick, in some instances, this razor wire that's put up has also prevented Border Patrol from saving people who are in life-threatening situations. The court, on a 5-4 vote, granted an emergency request filed by the Biden administration, which had argued that Texas was preventing agents from carrying out their duties. The brief order noted that 4 conservative members of the 9 justice court would have rejected the government's request. They were Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh. I'm going to come back to them in a minute and tell you how they're complete and utter shameless frauds with this decision. And they know they're frauds. They're aware of that. The Biden administration says the wire prevents agents from reaching migrants who have already crossed over the border into the U.S. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, a Republican, installed the razor wire near the Rio Grande at Eagle Pass as part of an operation to address illegal immigration that has brought the state into conflict with the Biden administration. A White House spokesperson on Monday said, Texas's political stunts, like placing razor wire near the border, simply make it harder and more dangerous for frontline personnel to do their jobs. Ultimately, we need adequate resources and policy changes to address our broken immigration system. Texas sued the Border Patrol agents. Texas sued after Border Patrol agents cut through some of the razor wire, claiming the agents had trespassed and damaged state property. A federal judge ruled for the Biden administration, but the New Orleans-based Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals last month reversed that decision. By the way, that's a very conservative court, saying agents could not cut or move the wire unless there was a medical emergency. Abbott's immigration enforcement plan, called Operation Lone Star, includes busing thousands of migrants to Democratic-led cities and arresting migrants on trespassing charges. The state previously placed buoys in the Rio Grande to prevent crossings, prompting the Biden administration to sue. The barrier remains in place while the litigation continues. That's another point to make, that these buoys in many instances also have razor wire on them. So it's like their only approach is, let's try to kill people or maim people who are coming into the country. I mean, it's kind of insane, right? You can believe in having a border while also believing this is not a crime punishable by death, right? Like immediate death because you're trying to get into the country. That's absurd. Even while the Biden administration's application was pending at the Supreme Court, the standoff intensified. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, that's the most corrupt man in America, by the way. We went through in detail all the corruption charges against him, but of course he was saved by MAGA. Rebuffed a Biden administration request that the state back off its takeover of a public park at Eagle Pass. That followed an incident in which 3 people drowned trying to cross the Rio Grande. That's what we talked about. The Department of Homeland Security said Border Patrol agents were physically barred from entering the area in responding to the incident. It is impossible to say what might have happened if Border Patrol had had its former access to the area, including through its surveillance trucks that assisted in monitoring the area. Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar said in a court filing on behalf of the Biden administration, the Department of Homeland Security welcomed the High Court's order. Enforcement of immigration law is a federal responsibility, a Department of Homeland Security spokesperson said in a statement. Rather than helping to reduce irregular migration, the state of Texas has only made it harder for frontline personnel to do their jobs and to apply consequences under the law. Paxton, in a statement posted to X, said the Supreme Court's order allows Biden to continue his illegal effort to aid the foreign invasion of America. That's an insane comment to make. The destruction of Texas's border barriers will not help enforce the law or keep American citizens safe, he said. The fight is not over, and I look forward to defending our state sovereignty. All right, there's a bunch of things to point out here. So first of all, don't get this twisted as if it's some sort of left-right disagreement or liberal-conservative disagreement. This has nothing to do with left-right. This has nothing to do with liberal-conservative. In fact, both sides of this case are conservative. The state government of Texas is saying, you know, we demand the right to do whatever we want at the border, including putting up razor wire, including letting people die and drown or whatever. They're arguing for a very conservative position. And the federal government's perspective is also, look, we're tough on the border. We want to enforce the law, but we're being blocked by the Texas National Guard, and that's not acceptable. You have to let us do our job, whatever that may entail. In most instances, it's going to entail being a fucking hard ass because the Border Patrol we're talking about here. But in other instances, it might require, hey, we got to save this child's life, right? So that's the first point. Do not think for a second this is left versus right or liberal versus conservative. This is a conservative versus conservative position. It's just about what's the actual order of command at the border, right? Now, here's the insane part of the conversation. Guys, this issue is not debatable. This issue is not debatable. There's this thing in the Constitution called the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause means, to put very simply, federal law overrides state law. And whenever the two are in conflict, you default to federal law. Why? Because they're higher up in the ranking. A state can't override the United States, the entire United States government, because then we don't have a country. If you say the states can override any federal laws, then there is no United States of America. There is no federal government. It's just 50 little independent fiefdoms that are their own independent countries. Now, look, you might prefer a system like that. Okay, but that's not the system we live in. So the Supremacy Clause is crystal clear. Federal law overrides state law. So in other words, in a situation like this, federal Border Patrol agents absolutely outrank the Texas State National Guard. What's insane is how rogue the Texas governor, Greg Abbott, is. Because he's basically saying, I don't care about the Supremacy Clause. I don't care about the Constitution. I don't care about the settled hierarchy. I want to make my own border policy. And I want to prevent the federal government from contradicting it, even in areas where the federal government is clearly correct legally. And so that's why you have a situation where there's razor wire all over the place. There's razor wire in buoys that are in the Rio Grande River. We're going to let people die because we want to let them die. That is totally unacceptable. Now, I mentioned how the conservative justices on this are complete and utter frauds. Why do I say that? Guys, the vote was 5-4. This was a 9-0 case. This should have been 9-0. This is a layup. This is a slam dunk. This is nothing. This is a I don't even know why they heard it type case, right? So all of the conservative justices who ruled with Texas on this understand the implication of that. Understand the implication of that. Now, would they turn around and say, think about this. Would they turn around and say, hey, I know marijuana is illegal federally, but the state government of California legalized it within their state. I'm going to declare the state government of California overrides the U.S. federal government. So California overrules the DEA, and if the DEA tries to do some drug enforcement in California, we're not going to allow it. We're siding with the state of California. They get to overrule. They get to override the federal government. Would they say that? There's literally a 0% chance. Pick any issue where they disagree with it politically, and 10 out of 10 times they'd say, no, the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution is clear. Federal law overrides state law. So weed is illegal federally. I don't care if you legalize it at the state level. If the federal government wants to enforce such laws, they have every right to do so. They're obligated to do so. So think about that, man. Think about that. By the way, this is the same thing. Antonin Scalia, who's this revered intellectual, the right-wing judge, Antonin Scalia, who passed away a while ago, he would do this all the time. He would suck himself off about, I believe in the plain-faced reading of the Constitution and interpreting the law as it was clearly written. Like, whatever the founders meant, whatever the plain text is on the page, that's what we go by. And then in some instances, when he agreed with the position, he would totally contradict his own ideology. And it's actually the example I just gave. When it came to, I believe it was the state of Arizona was trying to do their own border enforcement, and the federal government said, no, we're in charge of that. And he sided with Arizona and said, they have every right to do their own border stuff. But then when it came to weed, he sided with the federal government and said, supremacy clause, federal law overrides state law. So obviously the federal government has a right to keep weed illegal and not allow you to do weed in a case-by-case, state-by-state basis. So it's all, look, here's the bottom line. It is going to sound too extreme, but hear me out. The law is fake. The law is just fake, right? It's, these guys have their own political biases. They want that to be law, and then they rationalize, they work backwards from their conclusion to try to make the law fit what their impulses and preconceived notions and beliefs are. And that's what we're seeing here. Because again, I guarantee you, if this was a state trying to do some lefty-ass shit and the federal government trying to shut down the lefty-ass shit 10 out of 10 times, they would rule with the federal government and say, hey, the supremacy clause is clear. But since this is the border, and they agree with being more draconian, more primitive, more hawkish, they look at it and go, Texas is putting up the razor wire. Texas is letting people drown. Texas is being more aggressive and militant in dealing with immigrants, so we're going to side with Texas. And say they have every right to override the federal government, even though it's literally border policy, which is like clearly within the parameters of what the federal government is supposed to do. So it is wild, man. This is a wild case. The fact it was 5-4 should terrify you, because this was a 9-0 case. We barely held on to have the supremacy clause of the Constitution upheld, which is like one of the most basic things in constitutional law. Really, really wild stuff, man. Really wild stuff. And final point, and this is where we get even crazier. So Greg Abbott saw this ruling from the Supreme Court. You know what he did? He turned right around and said, we're just not going to abide by it. And he directed the Texas National Guard to put up more razor wire in reaction to this. So basically, they will just disregard any ruling they don't like. They'll disregard any ruling they don't like. That's what this is. The law is clear. The Supreme Court backed up the law. The Constitution is clear. He goes, we don't agree, so we're just going to ignore it. The left would never. The left would never. Now, by the way, you might say that's a good thing because they're upholding, the institutions, etc. Fair enough. But, every now and then, especially in instances where, our interpretation is the correct one, it's actually, I guess the point I'm making is, it can be commendable to disregard the ruling in a situation where the ruling is absurd, right? In this instance, the ruling's not absurd. The ruling is correct. And the right is still overriding it. Greg Abbott is still overriding it. Which, leads me to ask, well, what the hell's going to happen next, right? What's going to happen next? Are we going to have clashes between Border Patrol and between the Texas National Guard? Because we're not that far away from it right now. We're literally not that far away from it right now. It's wild, man. So, we're coming apart at the seams, man. This country's coming apart at the seams, and the fact that a case like this wasn't 9-0 proves that to me. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.